a scholar of 18th century British literature, and I study contagion. Now, when I say contagion, you might immediately think germs, those bacteria and viruses that enter our bodies and make us sick. But it's also the case that contagion can refer to something emotional, so a feeling or a belief that we also catch from others. And indeed, research in the social sciences on what's termed social contagion has documented this, that feelings can be interpersonal and shared, and that they can enter the body from the outside. So I'm a little nervous right now, and my voice is a little shaky, and you all may not want to or even consciously decide to, but you might be feeling a little bit of my nervousness as well. As a scholar of the 18th century, I can tell you that both of those meanings of contagion were present during that historical period. So if someone says contagion, they might be talking about a tiny, invisible material particulate that carries smallpox and the plague. But if someone says contagion, they might also be talking about a feeling like fear or anger that's absorbed when witnessing someone else experiencing those feelings or even reading about them. This duality in the notion of contagion, that contagion can be both matter and feeling, both invisible and hypervisible, is a problem, both in the past and the present. It's a problem because once I start thinking about contagion in all its forms, I'm reminded how radically open my body is to emotional and physical transformation without my consent. And once I become aware of that openness, I might get scared. And then what do? Do I seek to protect myself from contagion or not? If I do seek to protect myself, do I try to protect myself from contagion in all its forms or only some? And how do I even go about doing that? In considering the problem of contagion, I'd like to return to the 18th century because I think it has some pretty good examples of what to do in the face of our fears about it. The best of these probably comes from early 18th century writer Daniel Defoe. Defoe writes this crazy plague text, The Journal of the Plague Year, about the Great Plague of London in 1665, which his uncle Henry Foe witnessed and survived. And in this text, Defoe confronts what you do when contagion can be both matter and feeling, and considers several responses to the problem. So in his plague text, Defoe contends that the plague, or the Black Death, is spread by tiny material particulates that are carried in the sweat or breath of an infected person or the things that they touched, particularly porous objects like blankets or clothing or even the pages of letters and books. But the problem is, contagion enters the body insensibly, so you never know the moment you've absorbed the disease. You only know that you're sick when you sprout physical manifestations on the surface of the skin, so spots, blisters, or buboes that arise in the hours before death. But the problem is you've been contagious for several days, potentially spreading the disease to others. So from the point of view of self-protection, if you have to leave your house to get supplies or to check on someone you care about, you risk absorbing the disease as you come into contact with every person and everything outside your doors. Persons and things that look safe, but are actually contagious. So what do you do? Well, Defoe says some people do attempt isolation. So some people flee London, some people shut themselves up in their houses, some people even get on ships and go out on the River Thames and try to wait out the plague. But the difficulty is, if you're trying to wait out a plague, you still have to eat. And if you have to send someone out for food and that person or that food gets infected, you're in trouble. But it's also difficult to wait out a plague because you need information, particularly information about whether the disease is still out there. And the means by which that information comes to you might also be dangerous. So say you receive a letter from a friend, and that friend has the plague. If you handle the pages of that letter, you might absorb the disease. But it's also difficult to get information because, remember, feelings can also be contagious. So Defoe says, say you leave your house and you see posted lists of the dead, and you look around and you see fear in the faces of others, you might catch that fear. And Defoe thinks that could be deadly. He calls this being frighted to death. So then what do you do? Do you never leave home or communicate with another person ever again? Finally, we can see that contagion for Defoe, as for us, represents a kind of compounding problem. Because once I start thinking about contagion in all its forms, I'm reminded of all the inextricable connections that bind my body to others and to our larger surrounding worlds, from the air we breathe to the objects we read and write upon. We experience this now, I think. We might be physically distant from one another. We might be seeing one another only on screens, but those screens, in mediating our contact with one another, might be infecting or infectious. The real question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge once we're aware of it? Well, we could attempt complete isolation, which, as Defoe notes, just doesn't really cope with the fact that we need other people to survive. We could weaponize or absorptive openness. So Defoe mentions there's a persistent rumor during the plague that people know that they're sick, but they go out into public spaces and they try to spread the disease to others, although he says he can find no evidence of that rumor. The third option is potentially the best one, but also the most difficult. The final option is simply to be open to, rather than phobic about, transformation itself. That is, to accept the ways we necessarily impact one another and help one another anyway. Defoe's best examples of this, of strangers banding together to form new communities, of strangers helping and then burying one another, are scattered throughout his plague texts. In these examples of aid, survival, and death, we can see that being open to contagion is a wholly imperfect solution from the point of view of self-protection. I cannot guarantee my own safety if I go out and connect with others. In that same way, you couldn't really protect yourself from my nervousness here tonight. But that might be all for the good, because this final solution is one that acknowledges that our own living processes inherently connect us to the bodies of others and to our larger non-human worlds already. All of this is unavoidable, for good and for ill. Thank you.